Alright, so our first video is going to be looking at immigrants and urbanization. Alright, so the first thing I want to do is to kind of give you a scenario, okay? So the year is 1880. New York City's swelling population has created a housing crisis. Immigrant families crowd into apartments that lack light, ventilation, and sanitary facilities. Children have nowhere to play except the streets and are often kept out of school to work and help support their families. You are a reformer who wishes to help immigrants improve their lives. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to discuss these questions. What would you do to improve conditions? What skills do newcomers need to make it? How might immigrants respond to help from an outsider? And how do you think you'd react? Remember, this is all hypothetical. All right. So maybe for number one, you thought about, what would you do to improve conditions? You thought about maybe better housing, better sanitation, stuff like that. What skills do newcomers need to make it? Well, maybe they need, language. They need to be able to read and write. How might immigrants respond to help from an outsider? They might not like you at first, but depending on the situation, they might take you. How do you think you'd react? Well, if it were me personally, I would probably be nervous about the whole situation. Alright, so where did the immigrants come from? Well, they came between 1870 and 1920. 20 million Europeans immigrated to the United States. There had been a population explosion in Europe with about 432 million people, and there were many Asian immigrants as well. That will come over as we'll see Mexican and Caribbean immigrants and others. So why did the immigrants come here? Well, many were escaping religious persecution, also known as anti-Semitism. As well, that's an example. Anti-Semitism is hatred of Jewish people, okay, which existed long before Nazism took over Germany and Hitler twisted his ideology on people. To improve their economic situation, jobs, birds of passage, experience greater freedoms in the U.S., to escape difficult conditions, famine, land shortages from the rising population. Now, most European immigrants are going to arrive on the East Coast because they were from Europe, okay? What about Chinese and Japanese? Well, there's a much smaller number came from China and Japan. Well, they arrive on the West Coast. 300,000 Chinese came between 1851 and 1883. Many Chinese helped build the first transcontinental railroad, which we talked about in our last unit. Some will seek the gold rush in 1848. They call the United States Gold Mountain. From 1880 to 1920, we'll also see 260,000 immigrants arrive from Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other islands. Over the next 20 years, around 700,000 Mexicans arrived between 1910 to 1930 to escape political turmoil in their country. Any idea what this island is? Well, if you guessed Ellis Island, you would be correct. Many European immigrants to the U.S. arrived in New York. So they had to pass through an immigration station that was located on Ellis Island in New York Harbor. They were given multiple tests, and out of all the people that were denied entry, only 2% were denied entry into the U.S. Okay? Most immigrants were allowed only about 100 pounds of goods, so consider that most of your belongings, okay? Alright. The officials had to decide whether or not the immigrants would enter the country. So if they had a serious health problem or contagious disease, they would be sent home. Other than that, they were allowed in. A government inspector would then come and check their documents, and they will question every immigrant to determine whether they met the legal requirements for entering the U.S. So why do you think they were? What do you think they were? If you said money, well, you're going to be right. That's one of them. So what were the requirements for admission? Proving that they had never been convicted of a felony. Demonstrate their ability to work, or that they were able to work. Showing that they had some money, at least $25. So here's some exact questions. 1. What is your name? 2. Have you ever been to America before? Do you have any relatives here? If they answer yes, then they ask where they lived. Is there anyone who came to meet you at Ellis Island? Who paid for your passage? Do you have any money? If they answer yes, then the immigrant was told, let me see it. Do you have a job waiting for you in America? And finally, do you have a criminal record? Edward Farrell was an Italian immigrant. He said that the language was a problem, of course, but it was overcome by the use of interpreters. It would happen sometimes that these interpreters, some of them, were really soft-hearted people and hated to see people being deported. They would at times help the aliens by interpreting in such a manner as to benefit the alien and not the government. So Europeans had a lot of help in getting into America. Now, Angel Island is where Asian immigrants will arrive on the West Coast. It's in San Francisco, and this process was more difficult than Ellis Island. The conditions of the process was very disgusting. The questioning was very harsh, and a lot of times they were detained for a long period of time before they were sent out. Now, immigrants are going to settle with other immigrants from the same country. Why would you think of that? Why would they do that? Well, think of it this way. If you're trying to find a place to live, you need a job, you don't understand American language and culture, well, you know your own. Well, you can find people in, say, there are more, at one time there were more Italians in New York than in Rome. I think that's probably still true. And, the Italians will have to work together to find each other jobs. And they'll teach them, how to, eventually they'll learn English and so forth from them. We're going to see immigration restrictions. So America has become what's called a melting pot. Many cultures and races had blended together, but many immigrants refused to give up their culture. For example, Chinese Americans still celebrate Chinese New Year every year, typically. But many immigrants refuse to give up their culture. So we'll see nativism, which is favoritism towards native-born Americans, will begin to spread. New immigrants tended to come from Southern and Eastern Europe. They typically were Catholic, whereas old immigrants from the past tended to come from Western and Northern Europe and were typically Protestant. The rise of nativism. Some Americans don't like the fact that so many immigrants live in the U.S. Sounds familiar? Still an issue today. So nativism is an obvious preference for native-born Americans. So nativism will give rise to anti-immigrant groups. We're going to see a demand for immigration restrictions. And so anti-Asian sentiment. Chinese Americans typically work for very low wages. Native-born Americans were getting boxed out of jobs. So labor groups will begin pressuring politicians to restrict Asian immigration. So the first law will be the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which will ban most Chinese immigrants. There were some exceptions. They allowed students, teachers, merchants, tourists, and government officials into America. This wasn't lifted until 1943. We'll also see in Japanese immigration limited. In San Francisco, all Chinese, Japanese, and Korean children placed in special Asian schools. So this led to anti-American riots in Japan. People in Japan found out and were not happy. So in exchange for President Roosevelt persuading San Francisco officials to stop the separation policy, he Japan will agree to limit immigration in the U.S., and this became known as the Gentleman's Agreement. Alright, we're moving into section 2. Alright, we're going to be looking at the challenges of urbanization. So urbanization is a term that means the rapid growth of cities. Many immigrants came and settled in the cities in the early 1900s, settled mostly in the Northeast and Midwest cities to find jobs in the factories and businesses. And by 19, immigrants made over half of the population of 18 major American cities. Alright, so the immigrants settled in cities. Most immigrants became city dwellers, the cheapest and most convenient place to live, and jobs were more plentiful in the city. One of the things we'll see past is called the Americanization movement, which was designed to assimilate people of wide-ranging cultures into the dominant culture. This is a government program that helped immigrants learn more about the USA. So schools will teach them English, American, history, and government. Alright, with the invention of farming technology, fewer farmers are needed. Many farmers who lost their jobs to machines will move to the city to find other jobs. We'll also see African American farmers from the South. Between 1890 and 1910, 200,000 will move to cities in the North. We call this, I believe, the Great Migration is the correct term, but I'm not certain. They aimed at escaping racial violence, economic hardship, and political oppression. Urban problems. There became serious housing shortages. New types of housing were created so people could live in a small amount of space. So we have a row house, where a single family dwelling that shared sidewalls with other houses. We also have a tenement, which is a multi-family urban houses that often overcrowded and unsanitary. We'll see improvements done in New York City. In 1879, New York City passed a law that set minimum standards for plumbing and ventilation in apartments, windows for each room, air shafts. Problem was, people dumped their garbage into the air shafts. This would then attract rats, so they ended up nailing their windows shut. We're also going to see the creation of mass transit. Now that there were more people in the city, transportation became a huge issue. So they developed mass transit transportation systems designed to move large numbers of people along fixed routes, kind of like buses, subways. MARTA. We had a system in Atlanta called MARTA where I grew up. The city had trouble keeping up with these because they were used so often and needed new ones to keep up the demand. Sanitation problems in the cities. Cities had hard times supplying safe drinking water. People would throw their garbage out their windows, so the horse manure will pile up on the street. Sewage will end up flowing in the streets. And by 1900, many cities built sewers and created sanitation departments. We'll also see filtration systems and chlorine were helpful additions. Crime was another problem in the cities. Alright, when population goes up, so does the crime. Pickpockets and thieves will flourish. Some steal to survive, and the New York City police was relatively small, so they didn't make much impact on crime. Fire. They had limited supply of water, so most city apartments were made of wood, not concrete. People also used candles and kerosene lamps for lighting. So paid fire departments were first created in 1853 in Cincinnati. The automatic fire sprinkler was also created in 1874. And then finally, the last thing we're going to talk about today is the Great Chicago Fire, which the fire burned for 24 hours. An estimated 300 people died, 100,000 were left homeless, and more than 3 square miles of the city center was destroyed. Property loss was estimated around $200 million, and so 17,500 buildings were destroyed. And that ends our first lesson about cities and the problems they had, as well as immigration and where immigrants came into throughout America. Thank you, and we'll get to part 2 soon.